Hey there, everyone. Let me tell you a story that's mine. It's about me and my husband. It's a story that started in 2015, but things really got strange a couple of years later. Let's go back to where it all began. We got married in 2015. Back then, I'd already known him for 5 years. Our families, they were complicated, to say the least. His family was troubled. My cousin had married into it once and left with a divorce not long after. But my husband and I, we had something special, a bond. We understood each other. I thought despite everything, that's all we needed to make this work. In 2017, I moved to Florida from Toronto. But that year, something strange began to creep into our lives. It all started with a friend's wedding. I traveled back to Toronto for the occasion, planning to stay for a while. My husband was supposed to join me later, but as the date for his arrival got closer, things changed. We started fighting, and not just little arguments, real out-of-the-blue fights that made no sense. We'd never fought like this before, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. I remember thinking, it's a wedding, a happy occasion. Why are we fighting? At first, I chalked it up to the distance. Maybe he missed me, maybe I missed him. But when he finally arrived in Toronto, it didn't stop. When he got there, I thought things would go back to normal. I figured the arguments were just because of the time apart. But even when we were together, something felt off. After the wedding, I stayed back in Toronto while he returned to Florida to manage his business. That's when the hurricane hit. Power lines were down, the internet was out, communication became impossible. But even when things settled, he didn't reach out like he used to. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was unlike him. He'd always been attentive, always kept in touch. And now, it was like he'd disappeared. When I did manage to speak to him, he seemed distant, cold. He asked me strange questions. What do you want from life? What's your goal? Questions that felt more like accusations. I didn't understand what was happening. Our connection, the bond we'd always shared, it was unraveling, thread by thread. When I returned to Florida, things only got worse. Our home, the apartment we'd decorated together, it didn't feel like home anymore. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Even with the lights on, it felt dark. And my husband, he was different. He couldn't sleep in the house. He'd complain of headaches that would vanish the moment he stepped outside. He started sleeping at his office instead, saying he couldn't rest at home. Then there were the dreams, terrible dreams. He'd see people in his sleep, people who weren't me. He'd wake up confused and scared, saying things like, "It feels like I love her, but then your face appears and it all falls apart." And me? I started having strange experiences too. At night, I'd try to pray, but I couldn't focus. My ablution would break 6 times before I could even begin. When I did manage to pray, the animals in the house, the cats, the birds, would go wild. One night I was reciting verses from the Quran when I felt something crawling on my bed. I looked down and there they were, insects, hundreds of them, all over the bed. I screamed, ran to turn on the lights, but when I looked again, they were gone. It was like they'd never been there at all. The next day, I told my mother everything. She suggested we seek spiritual help. A scholar advised us to recite certain verses, to cleanse the home with prayer. I began to follow his advice religiously. My husband, though skeptical, went along with it. He let me pray over him, drink blessed water, and listen to Quranic recitations. Slowly, things began to change. He said the heavy feeling in his ears was lifting. The headaches were less frequent. He even started sleeping better. But then, one night, he had a vision. He saw a woman standing at the foot of our bed, circling it. When he tried to get up, she blocked the door, refusing to let him pass. He called out to me, but I didn't wake up. To this day, we don't know if it was a dream or something else entirely. As time passed, we started piecing things together. We found a strange amulet in his family's home, something covered in symbols we couldn't understand. When we tried to dispose of it, the arguments returned worse than ever. We fought over everything and nothing. It wasn't until much later that the truth came out. His mother and sister, they'd gone to a spiritual practitioner, someone who dabbled in dark arts. They'd done it to separate us, to break our bond. When he confronted them, they admitted it, every last word. We moved out of that apartment, out of that life, and started fresh. The heaviness lifted. The strange occurrences stopped. And us? We're stronger now, closer. But I'll never forget what we went through. The battles we fought against forces we couldn't see. If you're going through something like this, hold on to your faith. Pray. Trust in God. Because even in the darkest times, there's always light to be found.